Hello, my name is Vito Palumbo, and today I'll be covering the topic open source and how it affects our economy. As a brief overview, I'll be talking about the uses of open source in our economy, issues before open source was enacted, what open source development solves, methods of use, various licenses, future impact, and what can be done to support open source. From a business perspective, server software is one of the more frequent uses of today's open source. Server software such as Microsoft's IIS or Internet Information Services can be quite costly. So an alternative to this are open source platforms such as Apache HTTP Server, Nginx, Apache Tomcat, Node.js, and LightTPD. Apache HTTP was launched in 1995 and has become one of the more popular suites. It's also available in most stack setups today. Nginx is a reverse proxy server that is great for scaling. Apache Tomcat is an open source implementation of the Java servlet. Node.js is a server that JavaScript uses and is available in the mean stack. And LightTPD is an extremely lightweight server that is optimized for speed. All these platforms are updated constantly and they promote efficiency and ease of use for their clients. Continuing with uses of open source, development is quite popular and is considered the go-to source for free code and tools. A lot of programming languages are open source developed and made available to the public. Such examples as PHP, Perl, and JavaScript. There are also tools that have been made open source and available to the public. There are IDEs, actually, integrated development environments, such as Eclipse, NetBeans, and CodeLight. So if you've used Java, or the language Java, you've probably used Eclipse as your IDE, or something similar to it. When focusing on development, it's only normal to wonder where all this began. Today's most common practice for open source development is actually the code itself. So in 1998, the Open Source Initiative, or OSI, was enacted by Bruce Perens and Eric S. Raymond, who were originally part of the Navigator team, or Netscape Communicator. Shortly after the project faltered, it was later decided to release this code to the public, and this created a paradigm shift in the late 90s for other organizations to start doing the same thing as well. Before this initiative was even started, there were several issues that often led to a delay of code production. It was still thought possible to program, obviously, but production time was at an all-time low, and the amount of bugs encountered were technically at an all-time high. So other issues also included high cost for deployment and post-maintenance. Code itself wasn't accessible to other programmers, the source code that is. This was highly redundant, only because you could be programming something that was already available or should have been made available. There was very little collaboration at this time. And then ultimately, there's just not too many examples of code available to stem from. There was no Stack Overflow or other sites where people constantly collaborate for the better of the code. So then you may be asking yourself, what exactly does open source solve? Well, open source provides a foundation for continual software development at a higher standard than starting from scratch, which, like I said in the past, can be quite redundant. Though not all open source software is free, it's made available so that other users can manipulate it to their own choosing, without being blocked from the original source code. So, breaking it down, open source is very efficient, it's more stable, it's faster to produce, allows for better security, provides a cheaper solution, easily made available to the public, and then ultimately, I guess it's easy to scale depending on what you're using or your knowledge of how to scale. There are many methods of use. Now, to go over a few, open source has many methods available to the public. One can improve on a code that already exists, use code for other projects, cut costs of server software, which is, very wanting, and even collaborate through many open source channels. Some of which GitHub is a open source repository where anyone can collaborate on code or start their own project. Stack Overflow, another highly collaborative website so that people kind of get an input on their own software as well as what they can use in the future. WordPress, I happen to actually work with some WordPress projects, and they are a great community for collaboration within their own WordPress suite, which is basically a web development suite. And then that box down there, you see there's a bunch of open source things, PHP and Drupal. Now to talk about licenses that some of you may already know that encompass open source as a whole. So open source has adopted many of these licenses, each made to comply with the definition of open source, which is the software should be made freely, modified, and shared. Some can be more strict than others. Just to go over a few, GNU, I'm not sure what GNU stands for. I know that it's composed of two splits of GPL licenses, general public license. There's the MIT license, the Common Development and Distribution license, Apache license 2.0, and the Mozilla Public License 2.0. Those last two kind of go over their software licensing for the Apache server and the Mozilla Firefox suite. GNU itself is split into two versions, like I said previously, 2.0 and 3.0, which basically state that you can modify, share, reproduce the code as long as you continue the GNU license for any of the changes made. So if you actually reproduce this code, you also have to make that GNU available to the other user. MIT is fairly similar. It's basically made so that the user can modify, publish, and ultimately use the software as long as the copyright and the license notice is included in a substantial portion of the software, if not all of it. And then the Common Development and Distribution license is a little more strict than both of those in the sense that there's a guideline for each utilization of the code. And then Apache license is meant to keep Apache software free regardless of change. And the Mozilla license is basically demonstrating fair use for public software with a secondary GNU license attached to that as well. Now, the future impact of open source is very vast and covers a wide range of advantages and disadvantages. Some of the advantages would be that there would be more code made available to the public. Communities would be able to maintain this development and they would grow in contrast to that. More available tools will be produced for the codes and code suites. The disadvantages, basically the unique quality of code may fall short. And even though it says will fall short, it may, it may not. That being said, the code itself will be highly collaborative, and you may see a lot of similar code. Software companies will be forced to compete by making code open source, kind of like how the open source initiative started. Once the code was made public, a lot of people were on board with that, and they in turn started making their programs made available to the public as well, without the use of licensing at the time. And then ultimately the need for mass programmers will decrease in some areas because, yet again, the code is highly collaborative. So making the code easier to get your hands on or easier to produce will basically limit the need for a high group of programmers for certain projects. So what can be done to support open source? Well, in order for open source to continue to be our primary system for software development, people must contribute to it. So you must add to an existing program. If you can't find an open source solution, it's best to create your own and allow it to be advanced by others. Provide feedback to other developers within an open source network, such as Stack Overflow, or be part of someone's project in GitHub or WordPress. And ultimately keep things free. Obviously, people want to make money off their software, but that doesn't mean you'd have to completely lock your software. There's parts of it you can dole out to the public, making it free, easy to access, or even give your input. These are just some of the few ideas that kind of keep open source available. In conclusion, it is very easy to see why the open source initiative is very popular. It is a vastly expanding resource that provides many tools and education to the development community. And ultimately, it is up to us, the developers, to keep this initiative going for future generations of programmers. So do what you can to keep the code free. And here are my references. Thank you. Hope you guys enjoyed this presentation.